Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today I am joined by my friend Cathy Loerzel. Cathy, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
You were a guest before when we talked about spiritual warfare. Specifically, we talked about curses, agreements, vows, soul ties. But today, I've asked you to come back on to talk about engaging the particularity of our stories. If you are wanting to engage your story in more depth, if you're wanting to engage your story in a way that brings healing, Cathy and I are going to be co-leading a virtual conference on this very topic on Saturday, June 12th. And we're going to talk about the content, kind of give you a preliminary outline of the content now. The conference will be held via Zoom, and it's designed to help you engage your story in a way that brings healing. You can sign up right from my website. So, Cathy, let's talk a bit about like why we're doing this conference. Why are we doing it?
At the Allender Center and in my personal work, we talk all the time, and I know you guys do on this podcast as well, around the importance of story work. And the reality is we all live in a fallen world, but our bodies and hearts are designed for Eden. And so none of us can escape harm. I think that's the bottom line. None of us can escape harm, heartache, and trauma. And I think it impacts how we've come to engage the world. And so we're doing this conference to help us bridge the gap between how we relate to the world in both functional and dysfunctional ways that are broken, and the question of why. All of our current states of being, the ways that we cope, the ways that we soothe, the ways that we bring both beauty and brokenness to the world, are all connected to how we were raised. And that is science. Like we all know that that's true neurobiologically. Your first 2 months all the way up, through formative years directly impact who you are right now. And so for so many of us, even in the midst of the trauma that we're currently in our culture and through the pandemic, our ways of relating to the world are being exposed right now. This is not an easy time. And some of you are doing great. Some of you are really struggling. For those of you who are doing great, awesome. Write me an email and tell me how you're doing that, because I would love to know. Those of you who are struggling, we want to be able to help you understand why. What happened to you? Because we cannot, right now we're flying blind in so many areas. And this is actually a beautiful opportunity because the cement is wet because we're in the middle of trauma. And we actually have a moment in time where we can sink into it and say, okay, why am I this way? And what happened? And the way to that is through early childhood stories and understanding more of your family of origin.
Yes. And we should also announce, not just this conference, but we should announce that you and Dan Allender have co-authored a book that is forthcoming called Redeeming Heartache: How Past Suffering Reveals Your True Calling. When's it going to be published, Cathy?
September 14th.
September 14th. And you're going to be teaching some of the material from this book at the conference on June 12th, yes?
Yes.
When you think about the material that you and I will be covering and what we will be asking people to engage, who's this conference for?
My first answer is everyone. However, not helpful. So I would really put it into two categories. One, if you are struggling and you want to understand more of why, this is going to be really helpful for you. It's going to help you bridge some connections, understand how present is related to past. Our hope is to never leave you with just what's wrong. Our hope is always to bring you forth to hope, bring you forth to what are the possibilities, not a fake hope that's just like, be better, do better, get a wellness program and be better in 6 weeks. We're not talking about that sort of hope. We're talking about the deep hope of change and connection to God. And so, if you're in that camp, oh my gosh, I think this is going to be really helpful. And a lot of you, have been listening to Adam's podcast, have been listening to Allender Center podcasts, lots of things that are going on, and you just want to dive a little bit deeper into this work. This is going to be a great opportunity for you to do that. The other people that I think it'll be really helpful for are therapists, pastors, anyone who is helping other people and are kind of finding themselves in the midst of other people's heartache. This is going to be really helpful for you to understand what you're dealing with, what you're seeing, and what you're feeling intuitively, and how to actually help people move through healing.
Let's outline kind of the conference, like what we're going to engage for 7 hours on June 12th. And I'll start, and then you can share some of the material from your forthcoming book, because you're going to be teaching some of it. We'll begin by explaining why it's necessary to engage your individual story in your family of origin. And the basic reason, as I see it, is this: it's only the truth that will set you free. In other words, in order for your brain to heal, you have to name the truth of your story, or more accurately, your stories, because we all have many stories. And some of the stories you have are stories of harm, stories of being wounded. In Jeremiah 6 and again in Jeremiah 8, God gets angry. It's a fascinating place where God gets angry with the leaders of Israel for not taking the wounds of the people seriously. And this is what God says. I'm just going to read it. It says, prophets and priests alike, in other words, the leaders, all practice deceit. And then God says this: they dress the wound of my people as though it were not serious. Peace, peace, they say, when there is no peace. God's angry with the leaders of his people because the leaders aren't treating the wounds of the people as though those wounds were serious. They're not taking those wounds seriously. They're saying, peace, peace, everything's fine, but everything's not fine. And sadly, this is what many of us, I think, do with regard to our own wounds. We're like the leaders of Israel. We don't take our wounds seriously. And we kind of say to ourselves, peace, peace, everything's fine. But there's no peace in our bodies. We have symptoms. We have anxieties. We have fears, depression, relationship problems, problems with God. There's so much that our bodies are saying, like, it is not well with me. So engaging your story, particularly your story in your family growing up, is a huge part of what is required for healing. And we will expand on that at the beginning of the conference. And then, Cathy, you're going to get us into the nature of trauma and how it affects us. And this is where you'll be teaching some of the material from your forthcoming book. But can you give us like a 10,000-foot overview of this segment on trauma and our story?
Yeah, I mean, again, what we started with is harm and heartache is universal. But when we experience it, we deal with it and defend against it in very particular ways, according to what happened to us. So the way that we cope with harm and trauma is very particular to the way that our family of origin is structured. So you have to go back to your particular childhood stories of harm and trauma in order to understand how you built defense structures to mitigate the harm. We can say, like, yes, everyone hurts, there's pain everywhere, but you can't heal the universality. You have to heal in the particularity. And again, I love the fact that even in scripture, God constantly calls us back to our name, to our story, to what happened to us, right? That's his question to Hagar. What is your name? And where have you come from? And so this is the invitation of God, is to bring us back to our bodies, to bring us back to our experiences. And I really believe that by sinking into those particularities, to the stories, our hearts are set free. As we see and as we're able to grieve what really happened to us. My brother a while ago asked me why I was writing this book. And, they're a great Christian family and they love Jesus. And he's like, Jesus just washes away all of what happened to us. So why is this book necessary? And I told him, I kind of laughed. And I was like, look, if your life is great right now, God bless you. That's wonderful. I'm writing this book for you and for your kids for when it all starts to fall apart. And you need a place to go, and you need a place to start to understand why and how to heal. And so once you understand what happened, you can understand your current style of relating, and then you can start to move into grief, into sorrow, and then ultimately onto healing. And so there are three specific things that happen when we encounter harm at any age, right? And this is whether you come from a great family, a very dysfunctional family, it doesn't matter. This is what we all do when we experience harm. And again, I'm defining harm as the difference between Eden and the fallen world. We're not talking all big T traumas that are abuse and assault, like that is harm, but even small things impact us. And what we found is that we all relate to it the same way, regardless if it's big or small. And the three things that happen to us are fragmentation, dissociation, and isolation. Fragmentation is what happens when whatever we're experiencing is too confusing, it's too hard to understand what's happening, and we literally split our mind into different parts in order to be able to handle the bigness of the trauma, the bigness of the harm. And our job is to then help you defragment. Our job is to help you start to put pieces back together so that your story can be returned to you. And our belief is that that's actually how you heal, is when you can see the fullness of the story. So many of us are so afraid that if we know the truth, if we feel the bigness of what happened to us, it's going to swallow us whole. It's not true. It's actually the opposite. I think that threat comes from evil to keep us from actually leaning further into the work that we're meant to do to heal. But when you actually see the full picture, it releases something in your body, and you can then lean into the grief that you felt, but it also then pops you back over to a place of healing, of gratitude, of connection, of tenderness. Like, it breaks down some of the calcification that happens through harm. And that calcification is then also through dissociation. When it's too much, we literally leave our bodies, and we need other things. We need TV, we need alcohol, we need addiction, we need pornography, we need something else to soothe us and to take away the hard feelings that are happening inside of our bodies. So dissociation is something that we almost joke about now culturally. Because it's so rampant and we're so disconnected from our bodies. But that really has major implications for how you connect to your kids, to your friends, to God, to your spouse. You cannot be dissociated through harm and then still expect to have thriving relationships. And the third thing that trauma and harm does is isolate us. When it becomes too much, we back away from relationships. We become self-sufficient, and we stop connecting because it's too painful. So we'll be talking about the three of those things and how that impacts who you are, and really, how do you imagine healing taking place through understanding the why.
After that section, I'm going to teach about trauma and intentionality. Though there have been podcast episodes about this, this section is actually going to be rather new because Cathy told me about a phenomenal book called Brain Talk that was written by David Schnarch. And in Schnarch's book, Brain Talk, he explains a lot of the science behind story work. In other words, he shows you the interpersonal neurobiology that undergirds like why we do story work in the first place. And for now, I just want to highlight two key premises of his work that we're going to flesh out. And those two concepts are mind mapping and traumatic mind mapping. What does that mean? Well, when you're a kid growing up in your family, your brain has the capacity to map the minds of those people around you, especially your parents. All mind mapping is it's your brain's ability to make a mental map of another person's mind. In other words, your brain makes a map of what your parents are thinking and feeling as you interact with them. That's mind mapping. We all do it all the time. Now, traumatic mind mapping, according to Schnarch, is what happens When you are experiencing harm, for example, a story in which your dad is harming you, and as you map your dad's mind, what you realize is so overwhelming to your system that your brain collapses and you don't record in autobiographical memory the intention of your dad. So let me give an example. I know that was a lot. Here's an example that Schnarch cites in his book. He says, look, consider this girl, Lori. She's 16 years old, and her mother would frequently make derogatory comments about Lori's body. So when Lori showed her mom a dress that she just bought, Lori's mom said, it would look better on you if you lost a couple of pounds. You're such a pretty girl, but you really need to lose some weight, or no man will ever want you. And there's the interaction. So throughout this interaction, Schnarch is saying, look, this 16-year-old named Lori is mapping her mother's mind. And what Lori's brain realizes but can't metabolize is that mom is actually enjoying Lori's tears. Mom actually wants Lori to feel ashamed about her weight. But Lori's brain can't know, as a 16-year-old girl, what she knows. She can't know that. And so portions of her brain shut down. That's what Schnarch means by traumatic mind mapping. Let me just define it the way he defines it. He says traumatic mind mapping is a mental and physical impairment that occurs when you are mapping someone else's mind, and what you see is so terrible and upsetting that it makes your own mind and brain fall apart. And the net result of all this is that you don't record in your memory the intentionality behind your mother's treatment of you. Now, why did I say all that? Why does this matter? Here's why it matters. Because your brain cannot heal until it allows itself to know the full truth of your stories, particularly your stories of harm. The Allender Center, of course, has been teaching this for years, but now we understand so much more of the science behind it, and we'll explain all of this in more depth during the conference. So that's the segment on trauma and intentionality of harm. After that, we're going to talk about, well, I'm going to talk about triangulation and role in your family of origin. But even though I'm going to teach about it, Cathy, will you say some about what do we mean by triangulation, and what do we mean when we talk about our role in our family of origin?
I love that book. Thank you for bringing that in, because I think it's just so powerful. And I know that Adam and I can nerd out on stuff like that, but I think it's really important because that is what the defragmenting process is.
Yes. So say, what do you mean by that?
So what you described, Adam, with Lori's story, right? So if we were working with Lori doing story work, she would not be able to bring the fullness of that story to bear with us. She would probably bring fragments because the fullness is too painful still to really acknowledge. But now she's an adult, she has more capacity, so she wants to heal. So we know when we start to see fragments of that sort of story coming out in bits and pieces, our role is to help Lori put the pieces back together and hold with her what is too difficult for her to hold when she was a young girl. So really, we are helping map out the trauma in a safe, contained way where she can then have shepherds with her. So she's not alone having to acknowledge some of the pain and the heartache of what's actually happened to her. And so, we're almost midwives in the process where we help people birth their own stories, their own truths. And it's stunning to see. Adam and I have been doing this work for a while now. And every time, Adam, it's like a miracle.
But it's a miracle that you get to bear witness to. And I love your word, midwife.
Mm-hmm.
There is something so holy about working with someone to help them integrate the fragmented memories of their story, because you're reversing the work of evil in the world. And that's just fun to do.
And so I think even in this conference, right, we're going to help you start to understand both where you have had to fragment, where you've had to do traumatic mind mapping in order to survive, and then what is your pathway forward? How do you then do the work so that you, and how do you do it in safety, in community, with containment and attunement, kindness? And there are ways to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And there is hope and there is possibility. So, Adam, I don't quite remember what your question was, but it felt important to go back because it really does intersect. And the work is really to help you understand what was too difficult for you to see as a child that is now haunting you in ways you don't even understand. Because let's talk about Lori now. How is her relationship with her husband around her body? How does she feel about humiliation? Oh, I know what your question was. It was around role. So part of what we're going to talk about then is how does what happened to you also translate to the role that you played within your family? So there are lots of different roles that someone can play, right? You can be the favorite. You can be the one that is cherished, that is seen as, the golden boy who can do no wrong in the eyes of his mother. And his mother then connects with him all the time, gets him special things that no one else in the family gets. And she sits at night putting him to bed and talks to him about all the things that are wrong with her husband. That's triangulation. Triangulation is a relationship between a parent and a child that actually is serving as a surrogate spouse. So you're colluding, you're bringing a child into the inner sanctum of your world in a way that is inappropriate and profoundly abusive because it puts you in a place of power, of connection, and it sets you up to be a rival with the other parent if there is another parent. And so we're going to be going through, what does that look like? Are you that guy? Are you that kid who was brought into the inner sanctum of a lonely woman's heart and you were seduced into her inner world? And what did that do to you and your sexuality and your personhood and your connection then to other people, right? You could also be the scapegoat of the family. You could be the one who received all the humiliation, all the mockery. Everyone was up against you, and you were mocked and ridiculed, and set up for harm. Throughout both the home and then outside of the home. That could have been your role. Or were you just the one that was left to your own devices? Were you the one who was just kind of like, hope he's okay. He's going to be in his room playing with the stuffed animals, playing video games, and no one gave a crap about anything that you were doing. We're going to help you start to articulate some of the place you held in your family, and then connect that to how that impacted how you remain safe and where you defended and created unhealthy structures that are now not serving you well in your current world. So that's what we'll do around role.
Yes. And then you're going to share a sample story of triangulation from your book, Sally, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Sally.
And participants are going to get the story ahead of time. And then during the conference, you're just going to take a little bit of time to walk them through the story and show them where triangulation can be seen in the narrative itself.
Mm-hmm.
Which, again, if you're doing story work with other people, this kind of thing is really helpful because it's caught more than it's taught. Like you get a sense of seeing it in story by having somebody take you through an actual story and pointing triangulation out. So you're going to do that. And then everyone's just going to take 30 minutes to do an exercise by yourselves that's designed to help you identify triangulation and your role, if you're not the triangulated chosen child, to identify your role in your family. Because the bottom line is that the human heart changes primarily through engaging the particularity of your story. Books are important, conferences are important. We're doing a conference, but what actually changes the heart is when you get down in the dirt of your own story. And so we've designed this exercise to help you do that. And then after that, you're going to teach Cathy about how healing happens, not just in the brain, but in the heart. like what's involved with change. And you're going to take us through your U diagram, and you're going to talk about the healing power of attunement, containment, and repair. Basically, you're going to teach how Sally could experience healing. Yes?
Yes. In the book, we kind of lay out two different sections. One is an engagement that I had with my young son at the age of 5 when he had a traumatic experience, right? And so what we lay out, what we will lay out in this conference is that not all trauma has to become embedded trauma that stays with us and impacts who we are.
Yeah. So let me interrupt you. So what you're saying, Cathy, is that you can experience an event that can either become traumatic and traumatizing or not traumatizing to our body. Yes? Say more about that. How can that be?
Yeah, we are incredibly resilient and capable of metabolizing trauma if we have parents, caretakers, people alongside us that can help mitigate the harm. And so, if you have parents who were tuned, who contained, who were able to both experience rupture and then repair, which we'll get into those things, those are attachment theory jargon that we'll explain and unpack. If you have that live in the moment, something terrible can happen, but a parent can help move it through your body and you can heal right then and there. May take a few months, may need to return to it. And so in the book, we juxtapose the difference between the two. So I tell a story about my son, Liam, where he had a trauma happen. We worked through it. It then became a traumatic event instead of an embedded trauma that stayed with him for the rest of his life. Then we talk about Sally, who again, Sally is a made-up character, but it's the culmination of years of work that I've done on story. The story of Sally is what happens when you have trauma as a child and you don't have good caretakers who can help you work through it. And in fact, are the ones who are doing the trauma to you, right? Or actually abusing. What happens then when you're in your 40s, your 50s, and you're seeking healing? What does that process look like, right? None of us can go back to our 5-year-old selves in the actual moment and get parented the way that we needed. However, we can do that now, and it actually matters. It actually changes something in our neurobiology. We're incredibly resilient people, and we're able to change if we experience care and that defragmentation process with good people around us live in the moment. So what happens with Sally is that she goes to a story workshop and she actually has this experience where her story is read well. We go back into those places that she wasn't able to see because it was too painful, and we bring them back to her and she holds them and it changes her. So we're going to go through that U diagram, which basically says you have to understand the fullness of your story. It has to hit you rock bottom in your gut. And you have to realize, like, this is true. This is what happened to me. And as you experience that grief, then we have the possibility of going back up the U and actually getting to a place of healing. Really, it moves against the idea that we have in often in evangelical Christian context that says you can avoid suffering. You can avoid the depths of despair. You can avoid the valley. Jesus has the cross that goes over the bridge, and you just have to walk across it to reach redemption and salvation. And while that is true fundamentally, it is not what we experience in our lives. And so we're counteracting the idea that you can skip, like you can heal without having to go back. That is a fundamental lie. And it's why so many folks are living out of such wounded places.
What I would say, and I've said it probably over a dozen times on the podcast, but it's not just true theologically, it's true like neurobiologically in the sense of, it's the Faulkner quote, the past isn't dead. It's not even past. In other words, your past story is presently the filter through which you experience your day-to-day life in the present. And so what we're wanting to do is to help people live in the present, but there's no way to do that without engaging your past stories of trauma and harm and heartache. And that's what we're going to look at. And then I will teach a segment on grief, anger, and engaging God about your story. When you've experienced harm, heartache, tragedy, sooner or later, it becomes personal between you and God, because God is the one who could have prevented it and didn't. In the course of your life, you can either engage God about the laments and rages of your heart, or you can try and avoid that. And what we want to invite you to is not only to experiencing your own grief and anger at other people who have harmed you, but how do you engage God about the heartache in your story? How do you bring lament, grief, anger to God? And I read a book many years ago that was so helpful for me. It really provoked me to go deeper here. And it's called Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis. And it's a fairy tale. And in this fairy tale, the main character feels wronged by the gods. She feels wronged by them because of her story. And at the end of the book, she finally gets an audience with the gods, and she verbalizes her complaints against them. She yells at them for how they have mistreated her. And when she's finished, she goes through the whole story again. She's making sense of it. She's getting it out there. And then she says this is what C.S. Lewis writes: "The time will come when you at last utter the speech which has lain at the center of your soul for years." And the character says, "I saw well why the gods do not speak to us openly. How can they meet us face to face till we have faces?" Now, what is she saying? Well, C.S. Lewis wrote a letter to a friend in which he explained what he meant. And this is what he said. He said, "The idea of the book was that a human being must become real before it can expect to receive any message from God. That is, it must be speaking with its own voice, expressing its actual desires." And so we want to invite you to find language for the places in your story where you have beef with God, where you have lament, where you have argument, complaint. And this language is so prevalent in the scripture. It's in the book of Psalms, it's in the book of Lamentations. And to that end, we're going to ask you to do an exercise at that point in the conference of writing basically a psalm, your own psalm, to God that expresses either grief or anger and or lament about some aspect of your story. And this is where it can get really real between you, not just you and your own heart, but you and your God. And so we'll take you through that. And then we will end with a segment on it's so important. And that's not just the kindness of others as you're engaging your story, which is necessary, but the kindness of your own heart to the younger boy or girl that was you. So we're going to teach about your posture towards yourself and the necessity of kindness toward the younger you, or really the younger yous, because there are many of them. And very often we are not, I mean, haven't you found this to be the case, Cathy, that very often when we, if we're Sally, when we start to look at what it was like for us as an 11-year-old girl, we can be rather ruthless to that 11-year-old.
Mm-hmm. The heartbreaking part is that that's one of our only choices to survive.
Say more. What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
Well, when you're living in a world where your parents are not protecting you, you're living with mockery and shame and heartache, and that's your breakfast, lunch, and dinner. How do you not internalize that? And then that's how you've learned to see yourself. Adam and I were talking about Till We Have Faces, and I leave for vacation tomorrow, and I bought the book, so I'm reading it over vacation because I think the concept of that God wants to reveal who we really are, and who we are is beautiful and heartbroken and filled with Oh, mistakes and regret and places that we failed and places that we have brought, stunning beauty to the world. All of that is true. But for many of us, because of how we grew up, we had to sever parts of who we are, stuff them away in order to survive in the world that we are living in. And I think what God wants what is for all of that to come back to light, not just the good parts, but the parts that are achingly painful, that will bring agony. But what we still don't believe about God is that he actually meets us in the places of our despair. That I think Jesus is the most present when we are on the ground with our faces in the dirt, both recognizing how we have been harmed and how we have harmed others. And when we can do that with accuracy, oh my gosh, the freedom. I mean, when you are that close to both your glory and your depravity, and it is intermingled, and we understand it without shame, that's when we get to actually join God in bringing more of God into the here and now, into the world. We are not meant to wait for heaven to know who we really are. We are meant to find that out here on the earth so that we can bring redemption to others, so we could heal the world, so we could heal the earth, so we can join God in the redemptive movement. God set us up for a love story here on earth. And we get to be part of that redemptive arc only if we are willing to see what's really true about ourselves. I see this therapist, and she said it's the best parts of ourselves that are willing to look at the worst parts. And I love that, because it's only when we're willing to hold all of it together, but really know what's true about our parents, what's true about the world that we've grown up in, what's true about the world we currently live in. We turn away from it all the time, and we turn away from it and can't actually participate in redemption and healing because our own hearts are bound up in shame and regret and false stories that want to name us in a way that is not of God.
When you were talking, Cathy, I was thinking about the subtitle of your book, which is How Past Suffering Reveals Your True Calling. There is a relationship. I mean, in God's mysterious work in the world, there is a relationship between some of the immense heartache that you have suffered in your life and your name, your calling, what you are meant to bring to this earth in the particularity of your kingdom. And in Revelation, I can't remember if it's either chapter 2, 3, 10, or 12. There is a place where the Spirit of God says that when to those who have overcome will be given a white stone with a name written on it. And that name is known only between you and God. That's the identity that Cathy's talking about. That name. What is your name? Do you know it? Do you know the name that is written on the white stone? Because many of you are in the process of overcoming immense harm, heartache, trauma, abuse, and you are beating back the darkness until it bleeds light. That desire is what fuels story work. It is the desire for healing. It is the desire for freedom. It's necessary to propel you down the U and back up the other side. It's what fuels the fire of so many of the people that Cathy and I work with. And it is amazing to bear witness to that energy and that fire. And it will drive you to not only engaging your story, but to knowing this name that is yours and known only between you and God. And that's what we want to take you into at the end of the conference. So the conference will be June 12th. It'll take place over Zoom. You can sign up right from my website. It will be 8 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. Pacific time, which is 11 to 6:30 Eastern time. And we hope that you will join us to engage your story in more depth. Cathy, any parting words?
I think things in this country are going to get worse before they get better. And we need to be a people who understand how to midwife people through their journeys. As Christians, as believers, as followers of God, our call is to lean into the healing of our hearts. And again, you cannot do that if you don't engage your own story. At the Allender Center, we say you can only take someone as far as you've gone yourself. That is, that's what Adam and I do every day, is invite people further up and further into their stories, into this work, because we believe that we need an army of healers who are prepared, and you cannot do it from the sidelines. You cannot do it through the cliff notes of your own story. You have to do the unabridged version of your own story work in order to be people who can truly lean into other people's suffering and help them move into the darkest places of their stories, and also believe that the light will shine through.
Cathy, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Thank you for this book, your labor in writing it, and in bringing some of the material from it June 12th at the conference. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Adam. Look forward to it.